Let's take a journey back 100 years down the dietary history of the United States. What was the diet like back then? And how does it compare to what we have today? This journey will take us back to the 1920s, just a couple years after the First World War. The diet of the 1920s was influenced by several interesting events. We cannot talk about the American choice of food without talking about events such as the Prohibition, the booming economy, and of course, the war. This was the era known as the Roaring Twenties, and this was well reflected in what people ate. To understand the diet of an era, you must first understand what shapes the choices of the consumers. The 1920s were shaped by a fast-changing society, trying out new technologies and shaped by government policies. Whereas the 2020s are all about the speed and convenience of the food. We are willing to sacrifice the quality of the food as long as it can be prepped by the time you make it through the drive-thru because you have a meeting to get to, or a meal that you can stick in the microwave for a minute and 30 seconds because you just got home from work and don't want to cook. Food throughout the generations really tells a story. And the 20s food story begins at an ending, the ending of World War I. Food played a huge role in the war efforts during this time. People were told not to eat meat, and wheat was a luxury too. This was to ensure enough food was saved for the soldiers at war. Meat would become a huge part of the American diet during the 20s because people wanted to enjoy what they had missed during the war. Interestingly, there are lots of similarities between the 1920s and 2020s. The 1920s was the beginning of an era where processed foods found their way to the dining table. This was a result of the rapidly growing food industry, which would go on to becoming the largest manufacturing industry by the end of the decade. It was the era of popsicles, Wonder Bread, Twizzlers, ready-to-spread frostings, and many more. Sausages were very popular in this era too, and there was a strong German influence on the type of processed meat that was eaten in the United States during this time. You may be surprised to learn that hamburgers have a German origin. The same is true for hot dogs, or their original name, Frankfurters. What was eaten back then seemed a lot similar to what we eat now: processed food, junk snacks, and meat products. The difference is in the details. Chicken is very popular today, but back then it was not so popular. It was all beef and occasionally pork. There was a conscientiousness about healthy eating. At least that was the idea. But people seemed to get carried away with fads instead, which seems strangely similar to today. One fad that was trending back then was the fad for salads. You will agree there is no salad as popular as the Caesar salad. Guess what? It was created in the 1920s. Our great-grandparents were very much into the whole veggies diet, just like we are today. And what's also similar is they were trying to cut back on consuming cane sugar. It was in the 1920s that the use of honey became a popular alternative to sugar. Another fad was the substitution of gluten-rich food for gluten-free options such as potato flour and cornstarch instead of wheat-based cooking. But not everything was going in the direction of healthy eatings. Shortenings were becoming very popular. Crisco replaced lard in many recipes, and the options for these vegetable-based fats increased. Now when we view food over the last century, we may be consuming more terrible food today. For example, statistics show that hamburgers and cheeseburgers are the most ordered food in America, and 3 billion pizzas are sold every year in the United States. But don't let that statistic fool you and think that our late and great-grandparents were perfect. That's far from the case. The 2020s might be defined by fast food, whereas the 1920s were a home-cooked meal. But many processed and unhealthy foods were waiting at the door, as well as a lit cigarette coming from the living room. This was because many inventions were being created, and people were experimenting with new chemicals, production lines, and sugars. The age of invention had created the thought that larger companies would be better than your neighbor who was selling homegrown options. Turns out, we are paying for those once deliciously tempting consequences today. Multiple sources agree that the most popular breakfast meals are bacon, waffles, and pancakes. Add chicken to that waffle and you have another popular meal. Toast is also popular, and of course, cereals. All of these foods are quick to make, and they are all composed of pre-processed elements. We do not spend a lot of time cooking these days, do we? Back in the 1920s, women took pride in cooking. Despite the suffrage that came in the 20s, allowing women to vote and giving them more motivation and opportunities to do other things than be full-time housewives, women still loved to cook. Cooking was communal and nostalgic. So what would they cook for breakfast? Well, bacon was one of the top breakfast items yet again. Toast, sandwiches, butter, eggs, sausage, and a cup of coffee or tea were the staple of breakfast back then. The big difference here is that cereal and waffles were not part of the 1920s breakfast, but everything else seems to have remained the same in the past 100 years. Since breakfast is not the only gauge of what people's diets look like, let's look at the dinner table. Things look a lot different when you compare what Americans have eaten for lunch and dinner over the past 100 years. The immediate difference you will notice is the amount of fast food being eaten now. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, about 36.6% of Americans eat fast food every day. These meals are not healthy, but the problem does not stop with fast food. Even home meals, which many think are healthy, are no better nutritionally, as the food is pumped with hormones, pesticides, and artificial flavors. The typical American diet is often referred to as the standard American diet, which spells out the word SAD, ironically. This diet is characterized by high consumption of ultra-processed foods, added sugar, fat, and sodium, and low intake of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and lean protein. The SAD macronutrients consist of 50% carbohydrates, 15% protein, and 35% fat, which fall within the United States Department of Agriculture's guidelines, but the quality and types of foods matter more than the percentages. Some common foods in the SAD are fried foods, grain-based desserts, high-fat dairy, processed meats, red meat, refined grains, and sugar-sweetened beverages. These foods are often convenient, cheap, and widely available, but they can also contribute to many chronic diseases and health problems such as obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and inflammation. The most popular meals today are hamburgers, meatloaf, macaroni and cheese, French fries, grilled cheese. I could go on and on. These are so popular you're probably eating some right now as you watch this, or you've eaten these in the past week. But 100 years ago it was a little better. There was more variety and diversity in home-cooked meals, as cookbooks and magazines offered new recipes and ideas. The popularity of cookbooks influenced the diet of American homes by adding a lot of variety to the meals Americans were having. There was more emphasis on appetizers and finger foods such as pretzels, deviled eggs, cheese balls, shrimp, lobster, and caviar. Meals were influenced by European cuisines, especially French and Italian, as well as ethnic foods such as Chinese, Mexican, and Jewish. But it was not all wholesome, because that was the era that birthed fast food and convenience foods such as canned, frozen, and ready-to-make products, as well as soda, ice cream, and candy. As said before, people were conscious of getting their daily dose of vitamins in the 1920s, and this made salads very popular. The Caesar salad and candlestick salad were common dishes on the dinner table. To go with it, salad dressings such as the Mayfair dressing were created during this time. Desserts were a big deal as well, and this was a period when jellos became very popular, even though they had existed long before the 1920s. But the most popular dessert, and the one that defined this period, was the icebox cake. The icebox cake of the 1920s was a no-bake dessert that rose to popularity alongside the widespread adoption of the icebox, which was used for refrigeration back in those days. While similar desserts like this did exist, none were as popular during this decade as the icebox cake. One of the biggest draws of the icebox cake was its ease of preparation. No hot ovens or complicated techniques were needed, making it ideal for busy homemakers or those without baking experience. As I said before, our love for convenience will be our downfall. Actually, not will, it was our downfall. What do the numbers tell us though? Stats always tell a larger story. Unfortunately, sometimes it's the story we don't want to hear. So let's pause and be prepared for what we may find behind the curtain. When we look into the numbers, we see that nutritionally, Americans are eating fewer carbs than in the 1920s. But this difference is very small. Where we have the big differences are in the amount of protein and fats we eat. Protein consumption has almost doubled at about 170%. That is a lot. But the details are even more interesting when we break down the sources of the protein consumed over our 100-year period. The amount of red meat Americans eat has almost halved. That's because we are eating less beef, pork, lamb, and venison. So if we're eating less of all these meats, how come our protein intake has increased so much? This is because egg consumption, has increased by about 4 times what Americans ate back then. This could be because we eat a lot of fast and processed food, which has egg products mixed in. But the big difference is when you look at the amount of poultry consumed today. It's estimated that we eat about 500% more turkey and chicken than we did 100 years ago. Just from the 1970s to the 2020s, poultry consumption more than doubled. This is where the differences start to show in the diets of now versus then. You must have heard that Americans are eating a lot more fat these days. But how much more fat do we eat now than the 1920s? It is estimated that fat consumption has gone up by 200 grams, or 7 ounces. There are different types of fat, and not all are healthy. Consumption of polyunsaturated fat has increased about 4 times, while monosaturated fat consumption has almost doubled. Our calorie intake has also increased significantly by nothing less than 500 calories. A lot of these additional calories come from the fats that we eat today. Lard used to be popular fat back in the day, but that is history. We eat a lot less lard and switch our fat source to vegetable oil shortenings and margarine. Natural animal-based fats are consumed much less than what Americans used to eat in the 20s. Interestingly, we are making an effort to eat healthily in the fruit department, as our fruit intake has improved greatly compared to the 1920s. This is because fruits are easier to transport and keep fresh longer. The increase in the amount of cheese Americans eat now compared to the 1920s is simply mind-blowing. We are talking about over 5 times the amount of cheese. Now we put cheese in everything we cook. The most popular ones are burgers and macaroni and cheese. We are eating cheese in volumes we have never before hit in history. The good thing is that we are eating a little more veggies and fruits than our great-grandparents. This is a step in the right direction. If only we were not eating so much fat. Food and health can be a hard topic, but if we are willing to look for truth and promote what is healthy, or at least most of the time, we can create healthy generations moving forward who will thank us tremendously in the future. While the American diet has changed a lot over the last 100 years, we can agree that a lot remains the same, and there is still a lot of work to do to promote healthy lifestyles.